3 o'clock in the morning, somewhere in the middle of America, 1898. A boy of about 15 is running through dark streets with a list folded in his pocket and mud drying on his boots. He stops at a house, throws a pebble at a second-floor window, waits for a lamp to flicker behind the glass, and moves on. 4 more names to go. He isn't delivering a message. He isn't selling anything. He is the only reason a freight train will leave the yard at 4:30 instead of sitting cold on a siding until sunrise. And if he gets it wrong, if he knocks on the wrong door or misreads a name in the dark, an entire division's schedule collapses behind him. That boy had a job title. Thousands of American railroaders held it. It doesn't exist anymore. Not the position, not the pay grade, not the seniority list it sat on. Around 1920, American railroads employed more than 2 million people. Today, the major freight carriers get by with a small fraction of that number while moving considerably more tonnage than their predecessors ever did. That gap isn't one story. It's dozens of them, stacked on top of each other, and most of them ended quietly. So here's a different way to look at it. Instead of ranking these vanished jobs, follow one train through one night. Start at the moment somebody has to wake a crew. End at the moment the cargo reaches a customer. Every job appears exactly where it belonged in the chain, and every single one of them is gone. Start with the boy in the street. He was called a call boy, and in an era before telephones reached working-class homes, he was the railroad's alarm clock. Freight crews didn't work fixed shifts. They worked on call, waiting for their turn in a rotating pool, which meant a man might be summoned at any hour with as little as 2 hours' notice. Somebody had to find him, so the call boy ran. He knew which crews were rested and which were still short of legal hours. He knew which men lived above the saloon and which had a wife who would answer the door and lie about where her husband was. He tracked trainmen down at restaurants, at card games, at second jobs. He rapped on bedroom windows in the middle of the night and waited to hear a voice acknowledge the call because an unanswered knock was worthless. It was the entry-level job on American railroads, often held by teenagers, and it was also an education. One boy who ran calls in Illinois in the 1870s went on to lead a national railroad union. Another, who started as a call boy in Nebraska, eventually ran the Union Pacific. The telephone killed it first, slowly, as home lines spread through railroad towns in the early 20th century. Then centralized crew calling desks absorbed what was left. Today, an automated system sends a text message, logs the response, and updates the dispatcher's screen without a human voice involved at all. The knock at the window became a notification. But waking the crew was the easy part. The locomotive itself had been sitting in the roundhouse for hours, and getting it ready was somebody else's night. That somebody was the wiper, and further down the pit, the ashman. A steam locomotive was not a machine you started. It was a fire you built and then negotiated with. Before a run, the ashpan under the firebox had to be dumped, the grates shaken clear of clinker, the smokebox emptied of accumulated cinders. This was done at ground level, in a pit beneath the locomotive, by men working in heat and falling ash with rakes and shovels and hoses. It was filthy, exhausting, poorly paid, and absolutely essential. A choked firebox couldn't make steam, and a locomotive that couldn't make steam was several 100,000 pounds of scrap sitting on a service track. Above the pit, wipers cleaned the machine. They wiped down rods and running gear because a film of oil and road grime hid cracks, and a crack you couldn't see was a crack nobody fixed. A wiper was the lowest rung on the mechanical department ladder, and generations of engineers started there, learning a locomotive by touching every inch of it with a rag. Diesel electrics erased the entire category within about 15 years. There was no fire to clean out, no ash to dump, no clinker to break. A diesel had a fuel tank and a key. What had taken a crew of men and several hours became a fueling stop and an inspection form, which brings us to the man who had been feeding that fire all along. The fireman is probably the most famous vanished job on this list, and also the most misunderstood. The popular image is a man shoveling coal, and that's accurate as far as it goes. On a heavy freight run, a fireman might move several tons of coal by hand in a single trip, standing on a swaying deck, throwing precise patterns into a firebox door that opened onto a furnace. But shoveling was the crude part of the work. The skilled part was reading. The firemen managed water level in the boiler, watched steam pressure, anticipated grades before the engineer reached them, and adjusted the fire so the locomotive had power waiting when it was needed rather than arriving late. He was also a second pair of eyes on the left side of the cab, calling signals the engineer couldn't see. Then the fire went away. Diesels didn't need firing, and railroads argued that the position had become unnecessary. The unions argued that the second man in the cab was still doing safety-critical work, just a different kind. That disagreement escalated into one of the most bitter labor fights in American industrial history, running through the 1950s and into the 1960s. It came to a head in 1963, when a threatened nationwide rail strike pushed Congress to impose compulsory arbitration. The resulting arbitration board concluded that firemen were no longer needed on diesel locomotives in freight and yard service, with a small percentage retained for unusual situations. Fireman employment collapsed within a few years. Whether the second man in the cab mattered for safety is a question people still argue about, and the statistics from that period are genuinely messy. What isn't in dispute is that a craft with its own national brotherhood, its own culture, and its own path into the engineer's seat was legislated and arbitrated out of existence within about a decade. Meanwhile, out on the train itself, another job was disappearing for an entirely different reason. That one didn't end in a hearing room. It ended because too many people were dying. Picture a freight train in the 1880s descending a grade at night. The engineer whistles for brakes, and men climb out of the caboose and out of the locomotive cab onto the roofs of the moving cars. Each car had its own hand brake, a wheel on a vertical staff, and each one had to be set individually. So brakemen ran along the tops of boxcars in the dark, in rain, in snow, in wind, leaping the gaps between cars, bracing against a brake club to crank each wheel down, then moving to the next one. When the engineer whistled off, they did it all again in reverse. Coupling was worse. Before the automatic knuckle coupler, cars were joined with a link and a pin, which required a man to stand between two moving cars, hold a heavy iron link in position, and drop a pin through it at exactly the right instant. Get the timing wrong and you lost fingers. Get it badly wrong and you were crushed. The numbers from that era are hard to read even now. In the 1880s, railroad work ranked among the deadliest occupations in the country, trailing only coal mining. Coupling accidents alone accounted for an enormous share of trainmen's injuries. In 1 year in the late 1880s, more than 500 men were killed in link and pin coupling accidents alone. The fix existed. Air brakes and automatic couplers had both been invented decades earlier. What was missing was any incentive to install them across an interchange network where every railroad's equipment had to work with every other railroad's. Public pressure eventually forced the issue, and federal safety appliance legislation passed in 1893 mandated power brakes and automatic couplers, with a grace period stretching to 1900. The effect showed up in the casualty tables within a decade, and the job of the roof-running brakeman, the man whose entire purpose was to stop a train with his hands, went with it. Below him, meanwhile, the track itself was being held together by a form of labor that has almost no modern equivalent. They were called Gandy dancers, and they built and maintained American track by hand for the better part of a century. A section gang was typically 10 to 20 men responsible for a stretch of maybe 10 to 15 miles. They replaced rotted cross ties. They tamped ballast under low spots. They drove spikes, and above all, they lined track, physically shoving rail back into alignment after the weight of passing trains had nudged it out. A 39-foot length of rail can weigh well over 1,000 pounds, and moving it a fraction of an inch requires a dozen men to apply force at the same instant. Not roughly the same instant. The same one. Out of sync, and the bars slip, and somebody's hand is under a rail. So they sang. A designated caller led rhythmic chants, 4-beat couplets, and the gang tapped their lining bars against the rail until everyone found the pulse, then heaved on the call. The songs were work tools first and art second, though they were unmistakably art. Folklorists spent the 1930s recording them across the South, where section gangs were overwhelmingly black and doing what was considered the hardest and lowest paid labor on the railroad. Mechanization ended it. Ballast regulators and hydraulic tampers arrived through the 1940s and 1950s and did in minutes what a gang did in a day. By the 1960s, the tradition was fading out of working memory. Track gangs still exist, but they operate machines. The chant has no function anymore because nothing waits for a human count. Now back to the train, which is running through the dark toward a small station where a light is burning. Inside that station sits a train order operator, and for over a century, he was the reason two trains on a single track didn't occupy the same piece of it at the same time. Here's how it worked. The dispatcher, sitting miles away, controlled the railroad on paper. When the timetable wasn't enough, when a train was late or an extra had to run, he dictated a train order down a telegraph wire and later a telephone circuit to the operator at a station along the route. The operator wrote it out on flimsy tissue paper, repeated it back word for word to confirm, then set his train order signal to warn the approaching crew. Then came the part that made the job memorable. The train wasn't necessarily going to stop. So the operator stood at trackside holding a hooped stick with the order strung across it, and the fireman or the conductor hooked an arm through the loop as the train swept past at speed, snatching a piece of paper out of the air that told them where they were allowed to go. Miss the catch, and the train had to stop and back up, stand a few inches too close, and a shifted load or a loose brake shoe could take your head off. If you're enjoying this, subscribe. We cover railroad history and the engineering behind it every week. The train order system had been the backbone of American operating practice since the 1840s, when the telegraph first made it possible for one person to know where every train was. Centralized traffic control chipped away at it through the middle of the 20th century. Radio took another piece. The final blow came in 1986 with a national agreement letting dispatchers issue movement instructions directly to train crews, bypassing the operator entirely. Thousands of small station offices went dark, and a job that required a specific vocabulary, a specific handwriting discipline, and nerves at trackside simply stopped being a job. Our train reaches the yard around dawn, and here the vanished work is the kind almost nobody can picture now. Sorting a train meant switch tenders throwing every route by hand, lever by lever, in sequence, in all weather, hundreds of movements a shift with no margin for a wrong throw. But the stranger job belonged to the men working the hump. Cars were shoved over an artificial hill and released one at a time to roll down by gravity into whichever track they belonged in. A free-rolling boxcar has no brakes anybody can reach from the ground. So a man rode it. Car riders climbed onto each cut of cars at the crest, rode it down the hump, and set the handbrake at exactly the right moment so the car coupled to the standing string gently instead of destroying its own cargo. Then they climbed off and walked back up the hill to do it again. The whole throughput of a major yard was limited by how fast riders could get back to the top. Mechanical retarders replaced them, clamping the sides of the wheels to bleed off speed without anyone on board. Later, computers took over the retarders and the switches together, calculating each car's weight and rolling resistance and applying pressure accordingly. Two jobs, both physical, both dangerous, both absorbed into a control room. But the cars themselves still had needs, and one of them created an entire industry that has since vanished without a trace. Before mechanical refrigeration, a refrigerated boxcar was cooled by ice. Blocks of it, often around 300 pounds each, loaded through hatches in the roof into bunkers built into each end of the car, usually with salt added to drive the temperature lower. Ice melts. So the cars had to be re-iced roughly once a day, all the way across the country, which meant a national network of ice plants and icing platforms strung along the produce routes. A platform was a long, elevated deck level with the car roofs, and men worked on it hauling, chipping, and dropping ice into hatches at speed because the train had a schedule and the produce inside had a clock. It was brutal work in a strange combination of conditions, freezing hands and burning sun, done at the pace of whatever train was standing at the dock. Mechanical refrigeration units, self-contained and mounted on the car itself, ended it. The transition ran through the 1950s and 1960s, and the bulk of icing operations shut down by the early 1970s, with a few holdouts limping into the end of that decade. Today, the equivalent job is a technician checking a diagnostic readout on a reefer unit. Two jobs remain, and both of them rode inside the train rather than working on it. The first belonged to a man sorting mail at 60 miles an hour. Railway post office cars were rolling post offices, staffed by clerks who processed mail while the train ran. They weren't storing it. They were sorting it into pigeonhole cases and labeled pouches in a car 9 feet wide, working against the clock so each town's mail was ready before the train reached it. Some was thrown off at speed. Some was snatched from lineside cranes without stopping. The standard was severe. Clerks memorized enormous distribution schemes covering thousands of destinations, and they were tested repeatedly on speed and accuracy. You were expected to know where every town in your territory sat and which pouch it belonged in, and to know it while the car swayed underneath you. At its height in the 1910s, roughly 20,000 clerks worked aboard several thousand of these cars. By the middle of the century, they handled the overwhelming majority of the nation's non-local mail. Then aircraft and highway trucking took the volume, passenger trains disappeared, and routes were cut through the 1960s and 1970s. The last run came on June 30th, 1977, between New York and Washington. Clerks stood in the open doorways as the northbound and southbound trains passed each other north of Philadelphia in the middle of the night, saluting, whistles going. Only a few dozen clerks were left by then. 113 years of service ended in a couple of hours. And the final job is the one that changed the country. Pullman porters staffed the sleeping cars, making up berths, shining shoes, serving passengers, handling luggage, and staying awake through the night on trains where everyone else was asleep. From 1867 onward, the company hired black men for these positions almost exclusively. And for decades, it was the largest employer of black workers in the United States. The pay was low and the hours were extraordinary, with porters working hundreds of hours a month and depending on tips from passengers who often refused to learn their names. Many were simply called George, after the company's founder, a habit that told you everything about the arrangement. And yet the job carried real weight. It paid steadily, it traveled, and it built a network of men who moved constantly between cities and carried information, newspapers, and money along with the mail. In 1925, porters meeting in Harlem organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It took 12 years of pressure, but in 1937, the company signed, making it the first contract between a major American corporation and a black-led union. The organizing skill built in those years fed directly into the civil rights movement that followed. The job faded as passenger rail did. Automobiles and airliners drained the trains, sleeping car service collapsed, and the company ended its operations in 1968. The work continues in reduced form under a different title, but the world that produced it is gone. 10 jobs. Look at what actually killed them, and a pattern shows up. 2 ended because the machinery changed underneath them, the firemen and the roundhouse crews. 1 ended because the work became impossible to defend, the roof-running brakemen. 3 ended because a machine could do the same task faster and cheaper, the Gandy dancer, the hump rider, the icing platform worker. 2 ended because the traffic itself went somewhere else, the mail clerk and the porter. And 2 ended because a message that used to need a human being stopped needing one, the callboy and the train order operator. None of them ended because railroading got smaller. American railroads move more freight today than they did when 2 million people worked for them. The work didn't disappear. It got concentrated into fewer hands, into control rooms, into software, which raises an uncomfortable question because the process hasn't stopped. Right now, the industry is arguing about whether a freight train needs 2 people in the cab or 1. And the arguments on both sides sound remarkably like the arguments over the firemen 60 years ago. One side points to the technology, the other points to what a second human being notices that a sensor doesn't. Nobody in 1898 thought the callboy was a temporary position. Nobody on an icing platform in 1955 expected to be the last generation to do it. The jobs that disappear are almost never the ones anybody warns you about. So the next time you watch a mile of freight cars roll past a crossing with 2 people aboard the whole thing, count the ghosts. The boy throwing pebbles at a window, the man on the roof in the rain, the gang singing to move a rail an inch. They didn't fail at their jobs just stopped needing them.